All right, so here we are. It is August 6, 2022. Today is a special day, so we preempted our previously scheduled message when we were going to talk about Jesus in the Old Testament, a question that was asked me by my friend Lawrence at work. One of my work colleagues asked me about whether Jesus can be God and the Son of God. How could he be God and create the universe if he was only born 2,000 years ago of a virgin? So we'll address that next week, unless the rapture happens first, in which case I'll explain it to you when we get to the Father's house in heaven. But today, August 6th of 2022, is a very special day in Jewish history, and so we're going to take the day to talk about that. And today's message is called Tisha B'Av and the Coming Apocalypse. Tisha B'Av is a Hebrew phrase, a word that means the 9th of Av. Today is the 9th day of the Hebrew calendar month of Av. 5 important historical events occurred in the history of Israel on this very day, centuries apart from one another. That's serendipity. There are no coincidences in the Bible. This Bible is written by God, the Holy Spirit. How are you? God bless you. And so when we say, oh man, what a coincidence. Kim showed up at the mall at exactly the same time I was there, and I didn't expect to see her. What a coincidence. In the Bible, when happenstance occurs, it's not coincidental, it's God incidental. And so Tisha B'Av is a day that's commemorated in Judaism as a day of mourning, almost similar to the fall feast that we've talked about in times past, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It's kind of like that, only it falls every year on this very day, on the 9th day of the Jewish month Av, which today happens to fall on a Saturday, so it fell on our Saturday South Beach sermon series. So for those of you that haven't yet, like and subscribe to our YouTube page, South Beach Gospel Ministries. Smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, and click on that all alert, the little bell you can click on, getting alerts for all the stuff. So whenever we upload a new video, you'll be able to get it. So let's go back to talk about what is the momentous occurrence that has occurred throughout history on this day. And by these things happening, we know that God is still working with the nation of Israel. Israel, by the way, which is depicted right here on our little map here. Kim and I were talking just before we went on air, and she was saying, that's Israel? This little spot right here is the nation of Israel. This little light green area is the nation of Israel in the larger Middle East area. Israel is smaller than the state of New Jersey. It would be one of the smallest states in the United States of America if that nation became a state in the United States. And so we had a momentous occurrence yesterday, by the way. For those of you that haven't heard yet, there have been missile attacks from the Gaza Strip into the land of Israel. The civilians in Israel took shelter in bomb shelters over the night. So while we were sleeping, they were getting bombed by their enemies that surround them. And if you lived in the land of Israel, you would have to go into your bomb shelter because you wouldn't know whether or not your house was about to get blown up by a missile. So we see, just as Dave Hunt wrote in his awesome Bible prophecy book, A Cup of Trembling, where Dave made the point that Kim kind of brought up to me a little bit earlier. She said, Israel's so small, yet everybody's out to destroy her. Why is that? And I said, because Satan is the god of this world. Dave Hunt wrote a book called A Cup of Trembling, based upon that verse in Zechariah that says, in the last days, I'm going to make Israel a cup of trembling for all the nations round about. In other words, the whole world will be in a tumult over a tiny piece of land, smaller than the state of New Jersey. The whole world is in a tumult. And so we see that in these in fact, within the last 24 hours, attacks have been going on throughout the night into the land of Israel, which presages, I would submit to you, the coming Ezekiel 38 and 39 war of Gog and Magog, where the northern invaders come into the land of Israel and God has to supernaturally rescue Israel. That's not today's topic, but I would just remind you, as we see current events going on in the news, as I'm thinking about what I'm going to say about Tisha B'Av, I'm seeing on my YouTube page, I'm getting alerts on my phone about these bomb or missile attacks throughout the night into the land of Israel, which shows you and reminds us that we are living in the last days, and we're seeing the book of Zechariah being fulfilled right before our very eyes within the last 24 hours, because even if this isn't the exact precursor to the Ezekiel 38-39 war of Gog and Magog, it certainly is a fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy of what, 2,500 years ago, that says in the last days God would make Israel a cup of trembling for all the nations round about. And at the time that was written, Israel was a dung heap. You know, the Babylonian captivity had occurred. Israel was annihilated. In fact, that's part and parcel of what we're going to be talking about today. The 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, and the apocalypse, and why Gentiles should be concerned about it. Jewish people will observe Tisha B'Av just like they do Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where they, serious reflection on, what happened on this date. What we see is that God has, throughout the course of history, disciplined Israel as a parent does to a child that is sometimes wayward. Now, Kim has kids. I don't have any kids, but Kim, you've had to discipline your kids over the course of time, right? Sometimes you give them a spanking. Sometimes you ever make them go sit in the corner? Sit in the corner, go, no dessert, go to your room, no, no MTV, or, take away your video games or something like. God is doing the same thing throughout the course of history here. We find out that Israel became a nation after Abraham got his wife pregnant, Sarah, through the power of the Holy Spirit, because she was infertile. And that first child, Isaac, that was born was the first Jew. And from that person, Isaac, the whole nation of Israel arose. They went into bondage in Egypt for 400 years. And after, God used Moses to lead the Hebrew people that were slaves in Egypt out of captivity to take the land of Canaan and turn it into the land of Israel, which eventually became the monarchy of Israel. God had to then began to discipline Israel as a parent would a child with great potential who gets involved in foolishness. And sometimes the penalties were stiff and sometimes they were severe, which proves that the modern day liberal Protestants in the United States of America primarily, as well as the Roman Catholic Church, which is a worldwide Christian, in quotes, denomination, that's the largest Christian denomination in the world with over 1 billion adherents. Both the Roman Catholic Church and liberal Protestant Christianity teaches the false doctrine of replacement theology. Kim, do you know what replacement theology is? Tell us what that is. Come over and tell us on the mic because they can't hear you. So what's replacement theology? Pop quiz.
Believing that the church replaced Israel.
See, you guys hear that at home? Right. That it's gold star for Kimberly. Ding. Okay, that means that, as she said, there's a teaching that's very popular in the United States.
That guy who came here the other day.
And in fact, there was a guy, Kim pointed out, a guy came here last week. Go back to our video from 2 weeks ago, and there was a guy screaming at me about the nation of Israel about midway through the teaching. It was a guy who claimed to be a Christian who hated the nation of Israel and hated Jews. Anti-Semitism, by the way, is a satanic paradigm that shows that we're in the last of the last days, because God used the Jewish people to do what? To bring the Messiah who would be the savior of the Jews? No, to bring the Messiah who happened to be Jewish, who would be the savior of the world. There are way more Gentiles in the world than there are Jews. So Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach in Hebrew, is going to end up saving a lot more Gentiles than he would Jews. So the idea that Yeshua or Jesus is strictly for the Jews, or the idea that Jesus, a Jewish Messiah, the King of the Jews, as the Bible refers to him, is only for Gentiles as opposed to Jews, both of those positions are wrong. So the replacement theology position that's being promoted, many Presbyterians promote that. Individuals that follow the teachings of John Calvin, they're called Calvinists, but now because they know John Calvin was an anti-Semitic murderer who killed Jews for not converting to his form of Christianity, so now because John Calvin has a bit of a taint of anti-Semitic fervor, which even Adolf Hitler used the writings of Martin Luther, who was sort of the protege or the mentor for John Calvin. He used the writings of John Calvin and Martin Luther as a justification for his anti-Semitic pogroms, which resulted eventually in the Holocaust. I know that's a controversial statement, but check it out historically and you'll see that it is true. So our point here, before we go into the details of the 9th of Av and the 5 events that occurred on this very day, but in separate centuries, proving that God has been involved in the nation of Israel throughout the centuries for the entire course of its existence, which now is extended out to about 3,500 years. We've had the nation of Israel in existence. Israel literally means, if you translate the Hebrew and English, a prince with God. And so it's the only nation in the history of the world that's named after the God of the Bible. America, as I pointed out to you in our Once Upon a Time in America teaching on the 4th of July weekend, go back and take a look at that. America's named after Semiramis, the fertility sky goddess that is actually the origin of the Babylonian pagan mythos of the fertility goddess and the sun god king that is really Semiramis and Nimrod, ultimately forming the teachings that now are being promoted by the Roman Catholic Church. And unfortunately, liberal Protestant Christianity has adopted some of the false or aberrant teachings of Roman Catholicism, replacement theology being one of them. So today we're talking about a Jewish, I wouldn't call it a holiday, but a day of commemoration. So if you were a Jew, you would be commemorating today, and since today is the Sabbath, you have to do some of the ceremonial things the following day or the day after the Sabbath. So today and tomorrow, Tisha B'Av will be acknowledged and recognized throughout the world by Jews everywhere to remember when God allowed disastrous events to occur, which, my point being, that God clearly has not replaced Israel or the Jews with Gentile Christians from the United States of America, primarily Canada and United Kingdom. That hasn't happened, because if he had, he wouldn't bother with disciplining his children anymore, right? If you are someone's child and you get a bad report card and you get punished and you get spanked when you got home because you got all F's or something like that, then your parents are disciplining you because you are their child, and the parent wants you to do better, and they're trying to teach you. And that's what Tisha B'Av is really all about. God's way of letting the Jews know that he is superintending over them the way a loving and caring parent would over a child who has potential, but has sometimes the proclivity or tendency to become wayward and get involved with, you know how, like, you send your kid off to school and he's a good kid and he was always good at home and he got good grades in 1st and 2nd grade. Then in 3rd grade he meets a bunch of bad kids from, say the wrong background, and all of a sudden those bad kids are influencing your kid to do bad stuff. You find out from the teacher. What do? You punish them. You put them on discipline. I remember as a kid, I wasn't allowed to play with certain kids who got in trouble in school when my teacher contacted my mom and said, he's a good student, don't let him associate with the bad kids who are X, Y, and Z. And that's exactly the way it was. I remember my kindergarten teacher coming to my mom's house, my parents' house, my dad was gone to work, and sitting down on the couch in the living room in my mother's house, my mother and father's house, in the living room in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and having my kindergarten teacher give an overview of how things were going. And back in the day, that's what teachers did. They actually came into the parents' home and talked about the kids. And I remember her saying, oh, he's doing good, but don't let him associate with X, Y, and Z because they're bad kids and they're not going anywhere, and it'll be better if he... And so after that, I got the directive from Mom, you can't hang out with those kids because those are the bad kids. So that's what God was doing with Israel. When Israel started adopting in some of the pagan practices of the nations surrounding Israel. Here's Israel, and here are the surrounding nations. These surrounding nations in times past were doing stuff like Moloch worship. And Moloch worship we talked about when we did our teaching the Saturday after the Roe v. Wade decision came down, or the reversal of Roe v. Wade came down. We did Roe v. God, God's position on abortion. And we talked about how the United States had adopted the Moloch worship pattern of the Ammonites and the Moabites of killing their kids to make the sky god and the fire god happy so their crops would grow, and so that their kids that were allowed to live would grow up and be strong and become, workers on the family farm or something like that. Israel began adopting some of those pagan practices primarily when King Solomon, the son of King David, started marrying. He had like 1,000 wives and like 2,000 concubines or something like that. And many of those wives that he married were not nice Jewish girls, but they were pagan women from the surrounding Gentile nations who were practicing witchcraft and basically Satanism under the form of the worship of Molech, Kayun, Remphan, Marduk. All of these different names are really different names for Satan in a deity disguise, and it always resulted in children being sacrificed by their parents to help the crops grow, to help the wife, be fertile, to help, income, and to make the land more prosperous. Kill your kids, and Satan will give you a special blessing. He is the God of this world, we know, and Jesus told us that. And when Satan told Jesus, all the riches of the world are mine, I give them to whoever I please, Jesus didn't rebuke him because he was right. Satan can make us very wealthy, prosperous, and famous if we're willing to do things like kill our kids, bow down and worship him as God. But again, I digress. Tisha B'Av, on the other hand, was God's way of reminding Israel that God's not going to allow Israel to become a wayward child by being influenced by those other Gentile nations that surround the entire nation of Israel, at least 2/3 of it, as 1/3 of it faces the Mediterranean Sea. The other parts of the land that don't face the Mediterranean Sea are surrounded by Gentiles who are worshiping, as I said, Remphan, Molech, Marduk, the fire god, the sky gods, the fertility goddesses, and they were doing horrific things to their children, including burning them to death and putting them to death to please the gods and goddesses of the sky. So God did disciplinary things. And as I said, Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of Av, and the fact that when we look at our timeline calendar, 5 different historical disasters occurred in the history of the nation of Israel on exactly the same day. The most obvious of which, the one that caught my eye and caught my attention years ago when I first heard about Tisha B'Av, was the most amazing of them, the destruction of the first and second temple. The first temple, built by King Solomon, the son of King David, the Temple of Solomon is referred to, was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar, right? 586 BC. But then, about 600 years later, that's 6 centuries, more than 6 centuries later, Titus Vespasian, who eventually became an emperor of Rome, but at the time was just a general, destroyed the second temple, commonly referred to as Herod's temple, because King Herod, the titular king of the Jews, who was really part Jewish, part Samaritan, who was appointed by Rome as a political figurehead to be the, quote, king of Judea, or the king of the Jews. So Herod gave some corporate finance to allow for the rebuilding or the expansion of the rebuilt temple after Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first one in 586 BC, when God ended the 70-year captivity that we've seen written about in Daniel chapter 9. When that ended, Israel returned to the land. There was no temple, there were no walls. They had to rebuild the walls of the city, and they also had to rebuild the temple. Eventually, the eventual King Herod, appointed by Rome, gave monies to expand out the temple platform. And so commonly, the temple that stood at the time of Jesus is commonly referred to as Herod's temple. The second temple, Herod's temple, was also destroyed, this time by General Titus Vespasian from a different nation. The Babylonian Empire is the head of gold. Remember we talked about that, the metallic man imagery of Daniel chapter 2. The head of gold was the Babylonian Empire. That was followed by the chest of silver, which was the Medo-Persian Empire. And then after that came the Grecian Empire. It wasn't until we get to the 4th of the metallic man imagery that we even get to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire comes some, 4 empires after the Babylonian, or 3, Babylonian, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Rome, 4 empires later, ends up destroying the second temple of God, and it occurred by accident. They were actually trying to preserve the temple and the temple's artifacts as sort of a trophy for Rome, to show that Rome had finally defeated those recalcitrant, rebellious, religious fanatics, the Jews, in their own backyard. And so the idea or the plan was to take the temple and the temple artifacts as sort of a trophy for Rome, and eventually put statues of Jupiter and Zeus inside, which is what they did on the Temple Mount platform. But instead, they accidentally, as the story goes, shot a flaming arrow or threw a torch in, and it set some of the tapestries on fire. And we know that the temple of God was built with special cedar trees from Lebanon, and then they were plated in gold. And so Jesus talked about how, in Matthew 24, we're going to take a look at that, how he predicted that the entire temple itself will be taken apart stone by stone. What happened was, when Rome and the Roman soldiers under Titus Vespasian's control accidentally set the temple on fire, there are no accidents in the Bible. God intended for the temple to be destroyed, so he used the Roman Empire and the Roman soldiers as his, mindless sock puppets to do his will, just like he used Nebuchadnezzar as a servant of the God of the Bible to do his will, to discipline Israel. And so the temple caught on fire, and as it turns out, those cedar trees, which were the foundation built on the stones which supported the Temple Mount platform, basically cedar trees caught on fire, and the thin gold metal sheeting, and gold is the softest and most pliant of all metals, melted and turned into, almost like wax, turned into rivulets of gold liquid, and went down between the cracks in the foundation stones of the temple. So you had millions of dollars in gold that had melted down into the cracks of the temple. So after the cedar tree uprights of the temple had burned down, the Roman soldiers had to take the entire Temple Mount platform apart, stone by stone, to get to the millions of dollars. So God used gold sort of as a carrot and stick sort of maneuver to get the Romans to do the deconstruction plan that he had planned to discipline Israel. Why? Because when Jesus died on the cross 2,000 years ago, remember, after the 6th hour, Jesus is on the cross from 9 to 12, and then at 12 noon, there was darkness at noon. That's where the famous writer Arthur Kessler gets the name of his novel, Darkness at Noon. It's taken from the account of the crucifixion of Jesus. At 12 noon, when the sun should have been the highest point in the sky went completely dark. There was a solar eclipse from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, because that's the point of time, that last 3 hours on the cross, when God was somehow outside the space-time continuum, dropping down the wrath, judgment, and torment on Jesus that would be equivalent to all of us, 20 billion some odd human beings between Adam and Eve in the garden and the end of the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ. About 20 billion people are going to be born into the world on the planet Earth. And so if you multiply 20 billion times eternity, that's how much pain and suffering God had to drop down on his son Jesus during the last 3 hours in the earthly space-time continuum. But outside the space-time continuum, there is no time. So Jesus was basically able to suffer the equivalent of you spending eternity in hell, plus me, plus 20 billion other human beings, all in that 3 hour period of time. But when that 3 hour period of time, which equated to eternal torment and suffering for the entire human race that will ever be born, when that was completed and God said enough is enough, Jesus returned in his spirit to his body hanging on the cross, so that he would allow his body to die. And before he dismissed his spirit from his body, which was hanging on the cross, Jesus used the Greek accounting term tetelestai, which means, for accountants who collected tax for the Roman government, as you can remember, Kim, what does this tetelestai? What does that mean?
It is finished?
Almost.
Paid in full.
Paid in full is actually. So you would get stamped on your tax bill tetelestai, not meaning it is finished. It means paid in full, so that when the Roman centurion comes up, no, I already paid my taxes to Rome. Here it is. I got the bill paid in full. Oh, okay, you're good. So Jesus used that term on purpose. So he was letting us know that God the Father had accepted his suffering on the cross that went outside the space-time continuum times 20 billion eternities in a lake of fire. I don't know how it's done, but somehow God was able to transmit that onto the person and the soul of Jesus Christ, so that he would suffer as though he was the sinner that committed 20 billion people's worth of sins throughout their entire lives. And once that incalculable, incomprehensible, none of us can understand how much Jesus suffered. It wasn't the nails in his hands and feet that was causing him to weep and sweat, as it were, great drops of blood the night before the crucifixion. It wasn't nails in his hands and feet. It was the wrath of God that would occur between 12 noon and 3 p.m. He was already on the cross at 9 a.m. But it wasn't that caused Jesus to sweat, as it were, great drops of blood. It was what happened between 12 noon, darkness at noon, to 3 p.m. And then all of a sudden at 3 p.m., Jesus used the term paid in full. And it is finished. And then he dismissed his spirit from his body. And guess what happened over across the way at the temple? At the temple, the veil that separated the Holy of Holies, where God's presence would come on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, once a year, and the blood would be poured out on the mercy seat by the high priest that day of the year, that veil, which was about 3 feet thick, not wide or long, but thick. It was about like that thick, a gigantic curtain that was about 100 feet high, probably about 60 feet wide, but about 3 feet thick, so nobody could accidentally walk into the Holy of Holies, because God would strike you dead if you did that. So, somehow or other, some supernatural event occurred that caused the veil of the temple to be torn in two, rent in twain is what it says in the King James, from the top to the bottom, meaning that Jesus' death on the cross was sufficient to replace all of the animal sacrifices that had been going on in Temple 1 and Temple 2. Now we didn't need those anymore, because the actual Passover lamb that all those temple sacrifices were a type or a picture or a shadow of had come to fruition. What God was doing in separating the veil was to let the high priest and the Sanhedrin know, to teach the people that it wasn't necessary to come to the temple with the blood of bulls and goats and animals to atone for the sins of the human race, but that God had accepted Jesus, his son, as the once for all time Passover lamb of Exodus chapter 12 and Exodus chapter 13, which was a type or shadow of that which was to come. But what we found out is, as Paul writes about, is that the Jews, as a general rule, largely rejected the gospel of Jesus Christ. God bless you, man. What's up? And largely would not accept the gospel as Paul and the disciples preached it. So Paul tells us, and we're going to look at these scriptures in a minute, tells us that God used the Gentiles, who were so paganized, they were lost in sin, they were so hopeless, sacrificing their children to Satan to make the crops grow, that when they heard that there was a God who actually loved them enough to die for them, they were like, wait a minute. So this Jewish God manifest in flesh in the person of this Yeshua guy, he dies for us so that we don't go to hell and we don't have to kill our kids? Like, absolutely. God killed his kid, so you don't have to. And so when the pagans, the Gentiles, Greeks, Romans, Parthians, Medes, when they heard about this, they flocked to this new religious paradigm, like, a duck takes the water. Like, wait a minute, I don't have to kill my kids anymore to find favor with the God who created the universe? I can abandon Moloch and Marduk and Milcom and Remphan and Kayun, and I don't have to worship a fertility goddess that tells me I have to kill my firstborn? Oh man, sign me up. And so Gentiles came to Jesus in droves. Even Rome was threatened by the conversion of even the household of Caesar to Jesus Christ because of the preaching and teaching of Paul and Peter, who came after him. After Paul was beheaded by Rome, Peter came along after that and preached to individuals. Even individuals who were within Caesar's household came to Christ. And so Rome was putting Christians to death left and right because they were so threatened by this new thing. So the point was that God used the Gentiles and their conversion to Jesus Christ to make the Jews jealous so that they would eventually come to Jesus Christ. And we know that that's going to play out in dispensation of time known as the tribulation period. The church era, which is depicted right here on our diagram, between this point, the crucifixion of Jesus, and this point, the rapture of the church, which will occur any day now, is a 2,000-year window in time in which you can be saved just by believing in Jesus Christ. Come as you are, Jew or Gentile, male or female, good or bad, or in between, and you can have eternal life just by turning to Jesus, asking him to forgive you for your sins, and turning your life over to him. And then you adopt or take on the righteousness of Jesus, that was attained for us at Calvary. And so that's easy. It's like a get out of hell free card. But that window of amnesty that has lasted for 2,000 years now, which shows God's patience, is drawing to a close. And when the rapture occurs, it will end. And then there'll be a new dispensation of time, a 7-year period of time known as the tribulation period, the last 3.5 years of which is the great tribulation period, where you can get saved by believing in Jesus, but only if you allow the Antichrist to cut your head off and allow the Antichrist to kill your children. So, would you rather come to Jesus now free of charge and be able to store up for yourself treasures in heaven by telling other people how to come to Jesus free of charge? Or would you rather wait till after the rapture, in which case, if you've already heard the gospel and rejected it, then God himself is going to come to you and trick you into believing the lie of the Antichrist so that you'll wind up in hell because you rejected the gospel when you had a chance. The people that didn't have a direct chance to accept Christ after the rapture will then have an opportunity to believe the gospel as being preached by the 2 witnesses and the 144,000 Jewish virgins who will replace the church. The church doesn't replace Israel in God's plan. Israel replaces the church. When the church goes home to the Father's house in heaven to get married to Jesus, it's going to be the Jews, 144,000 of them, male virgins, who will become the evangelists of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But that gospel of Jesus Christ will be modified. You can get into heaven by believing, but you're going to have to do the good work of being willing to lay down your life and the life of your children and your wife and your family members in order to get it. If you believe on Jesus Christ, then you take the mark of the beast because you're trying to save your life and save the life of your wife and kids, which is a noble thing. Guess what? Nah, that's not good enough. You're going to wind up in hell. So those of you of the Pentecostal persuasion, the Catholic persuasion, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, all of you guys, I got good news for you. After you're left behind when the rapture occurs, because you guys won't be raptured because you're not really born again, because you're part of the 10 virgins, 5 of whom were unwise and didn't have oil in the lamps. You're nominal Christians, but you're not born again. So you can't go home to the Father's house in heaven because you're not really part of the body of Christ. So you'll be left behind, and you'll get an opportunity to earn your way into heaven by allowing your head to be cut off and allowing the heads of your children and your wife to be cut off after the rapture. If you take the mark of the beast, though, to prevent yourself from being martyred, God's going to reject you, even if you say you believe in Jesus. So believing in Jesus alone won't save you after the rapture. It'll be belief in Jesus plus laying down your life to reject the mark of the beast and to proclaim Jesus. So anyway, back to the 9th of Av. This shows you 2 things, and the key takeaway here is that God clearly has not replaced Israel with the church. Because if he had, he wouldn't have to bother giving Israel a reminder every so many centuries with catastrophes such as the first and second temple. Remember I talked about the first and second temple? Well, guess what? Both of those temples, the one destroyed in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian Empire, and the one that was destroyed by Titus Vespasian in the Roman Empire in 70 AD, some 600 odd years later, were both destroyed on the very same day of the year. It would be like on Christmas, the White House blew up, and then 600 years later, the new White House that was built 6 centuries later caught fire and burnt to the ground, by some coincidence. If that happened, people are like, man, what a coincidence. On the very same day, 2 accidental destructions of the White House occurred. Or is somebody trying to give us a message about something? God was giving a message both to the Jews, hey, you're my kid, and you're going to do things the way I say, or else. And if you don't do what I say, I'm going to send you to your room without dessert. I'm going to give you a spanking and take away your video games. And that's what God has been doing with the nation of Israel throughout the 3,500-year history of the nation of Israel. That's why the Babylonian captivity occurred. That's why the Roman pogroms occurred. That's why many things occurred. That's why the diaspora and the destruction of the temple occurred. When Jesus died on the cross, God tried to alert Israel to turn to Jesus and turn away from the temple sacrifices because Jesus completed it. But because the religious elite knew that that was their pay ticket, their meal ticket, they refused to teach the people that Jesus was the Passover lamb of Exodus 12 and Exodus 13. So they continued to do blood sacrifices in the temple for another 30 some odd years, 35 years. So God got so frustrated with Israel that they refused over the course of the next 3.5 decades to accept the gospel of Jesus Christ, while the Gentiles were accepting them left, right, and center. So God said, you know what, I'm going to destroy the temple just like I did in Babylon. Now they won't have an opportunity to go to the temple on Yom Kippur and make the blood sacrifice. And now they won't feel confident that if the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies once a year and pours some goat blood on, the mercy seat, I'll forgive their sins for another year. If I destroy the temple, I'll force them to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And so God has been waiting for 2,000 years for Israel to turn. And we know, because we're students of Bible prophecy, and we've read the book of Revelation, we know that that's going to occur during the 70th week of Daniel, when the church is replaced by the 144,000 Jewish prophets. And since rain is coming, we got a chart here. So we're going to look real quickly at the 5 historical events, and we're going to look at the scriptures that back it up. Tisha B'Av, on the 9th day of the month of Av, and we're in the month of Av for those of you that are out there. We're in the Jewish month of Av right now. Today is the 9th day of Av, here, August 6, 2022. These are the 5 events that occurred on the same day, centuries apart. The first of which we're going to look at comes from Numbers chapter 13, and that is the evil report of the Hebrew spies regarding the Nephilim giant cannibals in the land of Canaan to refute God's command to take the land. That was the first thing, and I was shocked. I knew about the first and second temple destruction, but I didn't know about these other 3 events that also occurred. When God told Moses to take the land of Canaan after the Egyptian captivity of 4 centuries, he said, go into the land of Canaan and take it. So they sent a bunch of Hebrew spies to spy out the land. And they said, man, the land is surely flowing with milk and honey. In fact, there were grapes that grew so large that they had to be carried on a pole by 2 different men. It seems to me that not only was human genetic engineering going on during that 400-year captivity in Egypt, while Israel was out of the land of Canaan that was originally given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then when they went into the land of Egypt because of the famine and then got taken captive as slaves for 400 years, the Canaanites and these other Gentile nations came in, and with them it appears the remnant of the Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6 verse 1-4 says that fallen angels, here we have it depicted here, interacted and married and had intercourse with human females that were really pretty, like Kim. If one of the fallen angels came, they said, oh, Kim, she's hot. I'm going to marry her and make her my wife. And because these fallen angels look like Superman or one of the superheroes from the superhero movies, somebody like Kim might say, man, you're hot. Even though you're not fully human, I'll marry you. And then they had kids. But because they weren't fully human, they created supermen who became the demigods of Greek, Roman, and Norse mythology. Thor, Hercules, Atlas, Achilles, Hector, all of these guys from, the Trojan War and from the ancient writings of the Greek and Roman poets were really individuals who were hybrids, half human, half fallen angel, supermen. They were considered demigods because they were so much more powerful and awesome than humans. They were worshipped and looked up to as godlike figures. And so what we find out then is that God said, go in and take the land. So Moses sent the spies into the land, and when they saw not only were there giant grapes and giant apples, apparently again, Satan knew something about genetic engineering. Not only human genetic engineering, but apparently agrarian genetic engineering. The Nephilim were so big that they had a hard time being able to sufficiently fuel their bodies, which were much larger than human bodies. You could have a Nephilim from 9 foot tall to 30 feet tall. So you would have, 4, 5, 6 times the metabolic daily caloric intake of a human being. You might have somebody who needs to eat 20,000 calories a day as opposed to 2,000 calories a day to be able to maintain their body. And so we found out that these supermen who were giants oftentimes were cannibals. They would eat human beings in addition to eating up the livestock and the produce of the land. They were, in essence, demonically sired supermen who were also cannibals. And so when the spies went into the land, they said, oh my gosh, we can't take the land because giants are there. And Moses got upset and God got upset. And Moses said, you're going to take the land, and we absolutely can do it with God. And eventually that's what happened. But that was the first bad thing that Israel did on Tisha B'Av. It happened to be the 9th day of the month of Av. The spy said God made a mistake in sending us into the land of Canaan because the Nephilim are there and we're grasshoppers in their sight. And we'll look at all the verses. We'll run through those real quickly before we end. Second thing that happened, the Temple of Solomon was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. That's reflected. For those of you who are at home taking notes, I want you to go back and read them. We're going to run through the verses real quick, but I want you to sit down and read these things after we talk about them so that you can learn this stuff well enough to tell your kids or your friends or your neighbors, because this is amazing stuff. This is not just for the Jews. This is primarily for the Gentiles, so that the Gentiles will know when the Presbyterians or the Calvinists or the Catholics or the Jehovah's Witnesses tell you that God has replaced the nation of Israel with the church or Christianity. You can say, no, God has disciplined his children the way a parent disciplines their kid who has potential, but sometimes get involved with the wrong kids at school. And so since God has been doing that and is still doing that, that means God hasn't replaced Israel. God is treating Israel as a son. And the church is supposed to be cognizant of that and see that and use that as fuel to make arguments to other people that are not saved, Jew and Gentile, to say, see, God is the God of the Bible is the God of prophecy, the God who knows things in advance and makes it come true. Okay, so what's the next thing? The Temple of Solomon. As I pointed out, Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 5 refers to that. Daniel chapter 1 verses 1 and 2, Daniel chapter 5 verses 1 through 3, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the Temple of Solomon. Guess what? 586 on the 9th of Av. Oh my gosh, what a coincidence. And so then you got to fast forward several centuries more, and then you get 600 years later, Jesus predicts in Matthew 24 the destruction of the second temple, Herod's temple, which hadn't occurred and wouldn't occur for another 3.5 decades. But Jesus knew, because he was looking down the corridor of time, that it was going to happen, and it did happen. And guess when it happened? It didn't happen on Christmas Day. It didn't happen on New Year's Eve. It didn't happen on the 4th of July. It happened on the 9th of Av, or Tisha B'Av, the same day, 600 years later, that the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, was destroyed. Okay, so what's the next thing? Okay, so we got the Temple of Solomon destroyed, 600 years, the Temple of Herod is destroyed, same day. Diaspora begins then, and that's when the Jews started getting pushed out of the land of Israel and driven primarily into Europe and parts of Asia, because the Romans said, if you see a Jew within 1 mile of the Temple Mount, there's a new law that's passed that says you can kill him sight unseen. And eventually, over the course of time, from 70 AD till about 136 BC, all of the Jews were eventually driven out of the land of Israel. God was manipulating circumstances behind the scene. Why? To drive Israel out of the land, to teach them a lesson. It was the same thing as a parent saying, you got bad grades or you played hooky in school, go to your room, no dessert, and stay in your room till I tell you to come out. God took Israel out of the land of Israel and said, go into your room and sit there until I tell you that you've had enough discipline. Then I'll let you come back and finish your dinner. So God sent Israel into Asia and Europe and took them out of the land of Israel and gave the land to the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be complete. And we have that verse in the Bible talked about as well. So what's the fourth thing that happens? The fourth thing is the Bar Kokhba revolt massacre. There was a guy named Judas Bar Kokhba, meaning the son of Kokhba. He was sort of a messianic figure. He was also a patriot for the land of Israel. He was sort of a messianic patriot figure, sort of the way Donald Trump is to conservative pseudo-Christians here in the United States or Fox News Channel on cable TV. Kind of a messianic figure. He's just a man, but because people are so desperate for any Messiah to come along, they'll pick Donald Trump, and they pick, this Judah Bar Kokhba guy. And he was a leader of a revolt against the Roman Empire. And I must say, I remember going into the land of Israel and doing a semester there at Tel Aviv Law School, and I remember we did a tour of the nation. And we actually climbed Mount Masada on foot. And it was like in the middle of the Judean desert. And it was hot, and we got to the top of it, and we saw where our Jewish historian told us this is where the Bar Kokhba revolt basically ended, where the Romans built ramparts up to the top of this temple fortress that had been taken over by the Bar Kokhba Jewish rebels that had beaten up the Romans and taken one of the fortresses on top of a mountain. And they held it for a long time, maybe for several years. Eventually, the Romans built up ramparts up to it, and eventually, after about a year or so of holding out, it became clear, thank you, Kim, that the Romans were going to win the war. And shockingly and sadly, the last holdouts of the Bar Kokhba revolt, rather than being taken captive and allow their wives and daughters to be raped by the Roman soldiers, they all committed suicide. So when the Roman soldiers finally got to the top of Mount Masada and broached the fortress complex, thinking they were going to take the last of the Bar Kokhba rebels into captivity and make them slaves in Rome, they found everybody dead. And the Jews were like, we'd rather be dead than live under the rule of the wicked pagan Caesars. And they killed themselves. And that, in essence, ended the Bar Kokhba revolt. So 135 BC, that's when the vast majority of the rebels that were part of the Bar Kokhba revolt were murdered en masse. And so the vast majority of them were killed in 135, and that pretty much ended the revolt. But guess what? A year later, on exactly the same day, and remember, the Romans don't know anything about the month of Av. That's a Jewish month, and a Jewish calendar they knew nothing about. They were under a Julian calendar. That was the calendar of the first of the Roman emperors. They were looking at it as we're looking at it today. The month of August, 6th day of the month of August, back in 136 AD. They didn't know anything about the 9th of Av, and they weren't doing it on purpose. But guess what happened exactly 1 year later? Exactly 1 year later, the city of Jerusalem, which had been taken by the Romans in 135 AD, when the Bar Kokhba massacre killed off the last of the Jewish soldier rebel patriots. A year later, on exactly the same day, the 9th day of the month of Av, which today is, the city of Jerusalem was completely destroyed, and it was renamed Aelia Capitolina, which is the Latin phrase renaming the city of Jerusalem, God's city, the city of the great king, the city of the Messiah, was renamed after a pagan Roman god. Why would God allow that? Because he's rejecting the Jews? No, because he's sending them to their room without supper and without dessert to teach them a lesson. But then eventually, after they learn the lesson, they're going to be called out of the room and they're going to be served dinner, and then everything's going to be wonderful again. That won't happen until the end of the tribulation period. So these 5 events occurred all on the same day, the 9th of Av. Let's look at the scriptures and the verses in support of that so that you know I'm not making stuff up. Lamentations chapter 1 is where we're going to go to first. And that, lays out for us this particular period of mourning that actually first occurred on the 9th day of Av. And this is what Jeremiah wrote in the book of Lamentations. The prophet Jeremiah wrote this 500 years before Jesus. How doth the city, referring to Jerusalem, sit solitary, that was full of people, how she has become as a widow. She that was great amongst the nations and the princess amongst the provinces, how she's become a tributary. She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheek. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her, and they have become her enemy. What he's doing is speaking metaphorically of the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem and the province of Judah. Verse 3, he says, Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen. She findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. Verse 4, Jeremiah goes on to say, the ways of Zion do mourn, Zion referring to Israel, because none come to the solemn feast. All her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Her adversaries are the chief enemies, and they prosper for the multitude of her transgressions. So, and that's the point. Jeremiah points out all these bad things that happened during the Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian captivity that occurred about 100 years before the Babylonian captivity. Israel goes into captivity. Why? We find out from Jeremiah. She is afflicted, for the Lord hath afflicted her, for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. So Jeremiah tells us all these bad things that happened. The Assyrian captivity, Babylonian captivity was because of the transgressions of the nation of Israel. These aren't happenstance occurring. This isn't just Satan being able to do whatever he wants with the children of Israel. It's God using pagans, God using unbelievers, God using Satan himself to work his will so that Israel can eventually be promoted. After the 7-year tribulation period, the church will come back with Jesus at the second coming, different from the rapture, and then the church will be exalted as the bride of Christ above all the people groups of the planet Earth during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. But the nation of Israel, the remnant that survives the tribulation period and turns to Jesus and is rescued by Jesus at his second coming, the nation of Israel that exists will become the chief of all the nations, so that Israel will be the capital seat, if you will, of the planet Earth. And so the church is destined to become the leader of the people of the planet Earth during the millennial reign of Christ, and the nation of Israel is destined to become the leader of the nations of the planet Earth during the millennial reign of Christ. So you have a dual function for the church, which becomes the bride of Christ, and the nation of Israel, which becomes the beloved of the Father. And they both will reign and rule for 1,000 years with Jesus in charge, and both of us fulfilling duties that are distinct for each one of us. So let's go on and let's take a look. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 31 and 32 and 33. Let's read it. It says, "For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. For he doth not afflict willingly or grieve the children of men." So what that says is, Israel is temporarily on timeout. God bless you, man. Just like the kid that's sitting in his room without dessert, he's being punished so he can learn something valuable to make him a better citizen. Israel is being temporarily punished, Jeremiah is telling us, and God's not going to punish forever. Eventually, he's going to take Israel out of timeout and bless Israel, according to all of the promises in Scripture. Now let's jump forward to the next passage that we're going to look at, and we can see that the Tisha B'Av day of mourning that actually began 5 centuries before Jesus, because the first temple had been destroyed. The evil report of the Hebrew slaves had already occurred. So you already had those two events occurring on the very same day, the 9th day of the month of Av, prior to the birth of Jesus. When Jesus came along, those 2 days, the 9th of Av, those 2 occurrences, both on the 9th of Av, but centuries apart, were commemorated by Lamentations and what Jeremiah wrote. So Jesus knew about it, Paul knew about it, the Pharisees knew about it, the high priest knew about it. They were already acknowledging Tisha B'Av as a day of in memoriam, of reflection, of God disciplining Israel for her wickedness, and looking forward to the time when God will return his blessings to the land of Israel after she grows up. It's similar to Purim. Purim is not one of the 7 feasts of God for Israel that we have sort of depicted here, which we know are Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, Feast of the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Those are the 7 Leviticus chapter 23 appointed high feast ceremonies for the nation of Israel. But Purim, which acknowledges when God used Queen Esther, a Jewish girl, to save the nation of Israel from the plot to destroy all of the Jews who were in the Persian Empire at the time after the Babylonian captivity. Queen Esther came along, married into the Persian royalty, married the king of Persia, and she went into the king to ask that they not be executed, as Haman, who hated the Jews, planned to kill all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Queen Esther went into the king without permission to do so, which could have resulted in her having her head cut off. And remember when her cousin, Mordecai said, go into the king and ask, because he loves you, to preserve and spare the lives of the Jews in the Persian Empire. And she said, man, I might get killed. And remember, he said, well, who knows? Maybe you were brought into the land, Persia, for such a time as this. In other words, to be able to use your wit, your charm, and your beauty to win the heart of a pagan king to spare the nation of Israel for God's plans in the future. So she went in, and the king listened to her, and the nation of Israel was spared. So Purim which is a feast or celebration that, even though it's not one of the 7 feasts of Leviticus 23, is acknowledged and celebrated every year by Jews worldwide. Worldwide Jewry acknowledges Purim as a special day, just like Christmas for Americans, or the 4th of July. It's the day that God supernaturally used a little girl to save the entire nation of Israel from, genetic extinction, ethnic cleansing, killing all the Jews that existed in the world at the time. And so that is the same thing that was going on with Tisha B'Av at the time of Jesus. And so what we do is find out that Zechariah writes a passage that's probably referring to this annual acknowledgement of the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av as a day of mourning. And so in Zechariah chapter 7, we find verses 3 and 4. Many Bible prophecy scholars say this is making reference to Tisha B'Av, if not by name, but by distinction. So it says, "And to speak unto the priests which were in the house of the Lord of hosts, and to the prophets, saying, Should I weep in the 5th month, separating myself as I have done these so many years?" In other words, he's talking about the month of Av. He says, should we continue to mourn? Does it please God that we do a ceremonial mourning? In other words, Israel is letting God know, we got the point. We remember you destroyed the original temple. And we remember how upset you were when the spies gave the false report saying we can't win the land of Canaan. And so we're going to acknowledge or commemorate that each year, so that we let you know that we know that you're behind these doings and we're trusting in you. So now let's go ahead and jump, if we could, to the next group of passages that we can look at that supports this. And let's go to the book of Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, we're going to find out that negative report I've talked about. Here it is. The book of Numbers, chapter 13. It says, verse 31. So Moses said, starting at verse 30, Moses said, "Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it." Referring to the land of Canaan, which had been given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but then the famine occurred and they went to Egypt, and then they got taken captive in Egypt, and they remained there building pyramids for 400 years. By the time they got released, the Canaanites had taken the land, and the Nephilim, the hybridized supermen, had colonized the land of Canaan and had used human genetic engineering to grow super big people, and agricultural genetic engineering through occultic knowledge that Satan gives to people who practice the occult, how to grow super giant grapes and pears and trees, so that the land was a land flowing with milk and honey. And God said, we're going to take that and give it to the children of Israel. And so here it is. It says, "But the men that went up with him said, We be not able to go up against the people of Canaan, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature." Great stature didn't mean that they were upstanding members of the community and that they had won a commendation from the Chamber of Commerce. What great stature means is literally they were super big people. They were really tall. And just in case the Holy Spirit says Kim didn't understand what I was trying to say, the next verse clarifies it, because in verse 33 it says, "And there we saw the giants." Remember Irwin Allen, the TV producer from the 60s, made a movie called, the TV series called The Land of the Giants. He was a Jewish guy, and he used Genesis chapter 6 as a sort of zeitgeist or a motif for a number of his science fiction TV shows. Lost in Space had the first 3 episodes dealing with them landing on a planet where there were giants, and he named one of the episodes, "There Were Giants in the Land," taking a quote directly from Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, and using it for one of the episodes of Lost in Space, the 3rd or 4th episode of the 3-year series. So it goes on to say, we saw the giants. That word in Hebrew is the Nephilim, which means the fallen ones who happen to also be giants. "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak." Anak, for those of you that don't recall, were the sons of the king of the giants in the Bible, Anak. And the sons and their grandsons were referred to as the Anakim, or the members of the Anakim family. And Anakim literally means the chained ones. And that's a reference to what happened to the fathers of those supersized hybrids. What happened to them? The fallen angels so upset God by interbreeding with human females that he locked them in Tartarus down below Hades before the time of judgment, before the end of the Great Tribulation period. Some angels are already locked up under chains of darkness because they transgressed the law of God so severely by interbreeding with human females that God lost his mind, to kind of use a human idiom, and said, I'm not going to wait to the end of the millennium. I'm putting those guys in prison right now. And so they were locked up, and so their sons, the giant Nephilim human hybrids, were referred to as the Anakim, or the sons of the chained ones, the chained angels that were now and are now in Tartarus below Hades, being held on the chains of darkness for their transgression of having intercourse with human females prior to the flood of Noah. And so it says, and there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. In other words, when they saw the giants, they said, compared to them, I look like a grasshopper in my eyes. And they say, and guess what? When they saw us, they thought the same thing. You guys are going to take the land from us? You guys are like a bunch of grasshoppers. We'll stomp you into the ground and make you nothing. And so they were terrified. So that's the evil report. That also occurred on Tisha B'Av. That was the second of the 5 events that occurred on this very same day as today that's commemorated as Tisha B'Av. So let's go to Daniel. Let's take a look. We talked about the first of those things, which was the destruction of the temple, and that's the destruction of King Solomon's temple. And so we see in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God. Did you catch that, Kim? God gave the king of the Jews, Jehoiakim, into the hands of the pagan oppressor, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. God used Nebuchadnezzar, the pagan king, to punish the king of Israel because he was trying to punish the land for their rejection of the laws and the rules and the regulations. Don't kill your kids. Don't marry, witches. Don't get involved in witchcraft or worship the Queen of Heaven. Israel's like, nah, we're going to do it anyway, and we're not going to give the land a Sabbath rest. So God said, well, you know what? I'm going to send you into your room without your dinner for 70 years. And then after those 70 years, I'm going to bring you out of the land and rebuild the temple. So it says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God. That's the first temple, which he carried into the land of Shinar. That's the province or the county in which the city of Babylon was located. Into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Wow, so God uses the pagan king to do his will. And we see that that's followed up several years later after Nebuchadnezzar has died. He's now replaced by his grandson, Belshazzar, the king of Babylon. Verse 5, we pick it up, and it says, starting at verse 1 of Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar, the king, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who is now taken over as the head of Babylon, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels, which his father, I said grandfather, I meant to say father, which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. And then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank from them. In other words, King Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, threw a big party in Babylon and said, hey, remember the temple my dad destroyed in Jerusalem? Well, before we destroyed the temple, we took all these cool golden cups and goblets. Let's bring those out and use them as party favors as we get drunk and have an orgy. And so they used the temple implements because the temple was no longer in existence. And very shortly later, during that same dinner, that's when God wrote the handwriting on the wall, many, many, tekel, upharsin, which sort of the Ugarit language says, count it, number it, complete it. In other words, God said, Belshazzar, I used you and your father to discipline Israel, but the time of you being used as my vessel is over. Now I'm going to replace the Babylonian Empire with the Persian Empire. And that same night that Belshazzar used those temple implements in his party, God sent the Persians in under the city wall of Babylon when they dammed up the river. And the next morning, without any bloodshed, the Persians took over and ended the reign of the Babylonians. And Belshazzar was shamed because he mocked the house of God and the implements of the house of God. So God will use Gentile, pagan, devil worshippers to work his goodwill for his children Israel, but then he always punishes the guys that punished Israel. You know, the Holocaust, the Nazis did bad things, but then God destroyed their standing in Germany. Some would say that, you know, the Germans lost World War II, but the Nazis didn't, because they came to the United States of America and began working under aliases in American universities doing MK Ultra and mind control stuff. But that's a talk for a different day, and we won't go into that right now. But let's go ahead and jump forward a few centuries. Now we get to the New Testament. And in Matthew 24, as I said to you, Jesus himself was talking as they went into the Temple Mount complex, and they would say, hey, look at this new temple that we built after God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the first one. And Jesus said, don't be impressed, fellows, because this temple is going to be destroyed stone by stone. And that's what you see in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapter 24. Let's go ahead and pick it up where we see that Jesus says in verses 1 and 2, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple. This is the temple of Herod, the second temple. And his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, see you not all these things? Talking about the temple of Herod. Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. That occurred literally 35 years later on the 9th day of the month of Av in 70 AD, when General Titus Vespasian of Rome burned the temple to the ground and then took the foundation stones of the temple apart stone by stone to get the gold that had plated the walls of cedar that had melted and ran as rivulets of gold down between the foundation stones. So they had to literally take the platform of the Temple Mount apart stone by stone to get millions of dollars worth of gold out of the cracks. They weren't trying to fulfill prophecy. They didn't know anything about the prophecy of Jesus from Matthew chapter 24. They didn't know anything about 600 years earlier, Babylon had destroyed the original temple. They were trying to get to the gold. But God was manipulating the circumstances to fulfill Jesus' words of 35 years earlier, literally word for word, so that we could see that long after Jesus died and rose from the dead and went back to heaven, this destruction of the temple stone by stone literally came true. And guess what day it came true on? It came true on the 9th day of the month of Av, which is today, but it was in 70 AD, 35 years after Jesus predicted that it would happen. So let's go ahead and bounce to the second to last of the verses that we're going to look at, and we're going to look at the same thing. We're looking at the prediction Jesus made in Matthew chapter 24 that occurred just shortly before the crucifixion, where he predicted that the temple would be destroyed. Luke gives us a little more detail than Matthew does of the same account. And so we're picking it up at verse 33 of Luke chapter 19. And this is the so-called triumphal entry. And those of you that are students of Bible prophecy, you know that the triumphal entry occurs on what day? Again, mathematically, the Bible is supernaturally written by God. It's a book of prophecy because it's the 69th week of Daniel. It is the 173,880th day after the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus, who was one of the Babylonian or the Medo-Persian leaders who took over after Babylon, that gave the decree allowing Israel to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls of the city. And remember, Gabriel, the angel, told Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 that it's going to be 69 weeks of years later that the Messiah is going to show up to die, but not for himself, but for the sins of the whole world. And that is exactly 173,880 days later, Jesus shows up on what we call Palm Sunday, the Sunday before the crucifixion. And that's what Luke is writing about, but it also ties into our ninth day of Av because it's a prediction of what's going to occur on the ninth day of Av in 70 AD, 35 years later. And we pick it up, verse 33, and it says, "And as they were loosing the colt, the owners thereof said, Why do ye loose the colt? And they said, The Lord have need of him. And then it goes on to say, And they brought him, the colt, to Jesus. And they cast their garments upon the colt, and Jesus sat thereon. And as he went, they spread their clothes in the way. And when he was come nigh, even now, at the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Remember, that's the messianic psalm that you're not supposed to use unless you're referring directly to the Messiah. And so the religious leaders of the land of Israel lost their minds when they heard this and got upset because basically they were saying Jesus is the Messiah, the King of Israel. And in verse 39 it says, "And some of the Pharisees from among the multitude said to them, Master, rebuke thy disciples. And Jesus answered and said unto them, I tell thee, that if these should hold their peace, the very stones would immediately cry out." Why? As Chuck Missler has said, because today was the day. What day? It was the 69th week of Daniel, the 173,880th day after the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus in Nisan 10, 445 BC, all the way through to Nisan 10, 32 AD, which is exactly 483 years to the day after it was supposed to happen. It did happen. And then it goes on to say in verse 41, Jesus explains why this is occurring. And this is why the temple was eventually destroyed 35 years later on the ninth day of Av in 70 AD, 35 years after Jesus said this. He says in verse 41, "And when he was come near to Jerusalem in the temple, he beheld the city and wept over it, saying, If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace. But now they are hid from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation." Notice what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not saying the Romans aren't going to leave one stone upon another because there's millions of dollars of gold. There's gold in them dollar stones, and they're taking the Temple Mount apart to get millions of dollars of stone. But Jesus is saying, no, that's the subterfuge reason that God the Father put into the hearts and the minds of the Roman sock puppets who were doing the will of Jehovah God, the God of Israel. The real reason that the temple was taken apart stone by stone is because this was the 69th week of Daniel, the 483 years after the fact to the day when they were supposed to know, because they had 483, almost 500 years advance notice, the very day the Messiah would show up to become the King of Israel. They were supposed to cry out, "Oh, blessed be the King who comes in the name of the Lord." Not just his disciples. And so when Jesus told the Pharisees, if my disciples hadn't said this, God the Father would have made the rocks. And if God can make a donkey talk, don't doubt that he could make a rock talk too. That would have been something, right? The stones would have cried out, "Jesus is the Messiah, blessed be the King who comes in the name of the Lord." Why? Because Israel was supposed to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah on this specific day, 483 years after the fact, when God announced to Daniel, this is the day you're supposed to accept him as the Messiah. But because they didn't accept him as the Messiah, God says, I'm going to tear the temple apart, stone by stone, because of your unbelief. Not because the Romans want gold. That's the reason they thought they were doing it. But they were really doing it because God was trying to send a message to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles, that the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, is the God, the only God there is, and that all people, Jew and Gentile, young and old, fat and skinny, pretty and not so pretty, everybody, good and bad, has to come to Jesus to be saved. And so because they didn't do that on the appointed day, the 69th week of Daniel day, God said, I'm going to destroy the temple. He didn't do it that day. He did it 35 years later on, guess what? Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, which today is. And that occurred in 70 AD, which is what? Add 70 times 586 plus 70 is what, Kim? That's more than 600 years. So more than 6 centuries after the first temple was destroyed on the 9th day of the month of Av, the second temple was destroyed on the 9th day of the month of Av by a completely different empire that knew nothing about the Bible. The Babylonians didn't know anything about the Jewish Bible, and the Romans didn't know anything about the Jewish Bible. They weren't trying to fulfill Bible prophecy. They were trying to get gold out of the cracks in the rock on the Temple Mount platform. They didn't know they were fulfilling Bible prophecy that had been written centuries in advance. But you and I know that. Why? Because we read the Bible. And Kim, that does what? It builds our faith so that we can come out in public and proclaim Jesus as the Messiah, God in human flesh, the only kinsman redeemer and the only Savior, and our great God and Savior, the only way we can get into heaven. And we can do it with boldness, even though a lot of the people down at South Beach, a lot of people in New York City, a lot of the people in Las Vegas, a lot of people in Tel Aviv, Israel, a lot of people all over the world don't acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. And so when most of the people don't believe stuff you believe in, sometimes you get scared to go out and say stuff. Because you start a new school the first day of class, the new kid in class, you're the stranger and you feel insecure because everybody's friends except you. You don't know anybody and they're all clicked together. That's what it's like to go out and preach Jesus to the public. It's like Paul going to Mars Hill. People look at you and say, what is this strange babbling about this strange new God that you say? And so you go out, but what God does is he puts Bible prophecy into this little book of books, the Bible, and it gives us confidence. Even though the vast majority of the people I might encounter in a given day on South Beach don't acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah, whether they be Jewish or Gentile, I can still go out with great confidence because I can read the Bible and I can see that history was predicted centuries in advance, and then it actually happened to the letter on the very day, 483 years to the day after it was supposed to happen. So once I see that, I get so much confidence that, wow, this is the holy book of truth. It's not just the holy book of Christians. The Quran is the holy book of Muslims. The Vedas are the holy books of the Hindus. The Bhagavad Gita is another holy book of the Hindus. They have faith in the Bhagavad Gitas and the Vedas. But I can have more faith in the Bible because it proves, faith alone, just because my parents were Hindus, I'm going to be a Hindu. Because my parents were Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm going to be a Jehovah's Witness. That's not the type of faith that the Bible tells us to have. We're supposed to have a sure faith based upon reason. So I got a reason to believe that the Bible, the God of Israel, is the one true God of the universe, and not Lord Ganesha of the Hindus, or Shiva, or Kali, or Muhammad, or Allah, or any of the other gods, the Zoroastrian God, Ahura Mazda. There's a name for you, Ahura Mazda, the God of the, of the Persians. I can reject all those gods for the God of the Bible, who comes to us in the form of a man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Why? Because the Bible contains prophecy of things that hadn't yet happened, and then it happens to the letter. I've gone on so long, so we're going to stop, but we're going to stop on really the chapter that sums it up and ties it all together. This message, the message of Tisha B'Av, and I say the coming apocalypse, what I'm saying is, if the prophecies of the past relating to the destruction of the first and second temple came true literally to the day that they were supposed to happen, then you can be sure that the remaining prophecies that we find unfulfilled in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, that's going to come true too. And that book is really called, in Greek, the apocalypsis. Apocalypsis is a Greek word which means unveiling or the revealing. The book of Revelation takes its name from the Greek title apocalypsis, which means the unveiling of the last plans for man from the God of the Bible, the God of Israel. And we know that that plan includes the removal of God's people, the church, primarily Gentiles now, to the Father's house in heaven for a 7-year period of time called the 70th week of Daniel. Not to be confused with the first 69 weeks of Daniel up to the crucifixion. We just read that in Luke chapter 19. But the last of the 70 weeks of Daniel is called the 70th week of Daniel, meaning the last group was 7 years. The first group of 69, grouping of 7 years, 69 times 7 is 483 years. The last week, or the last group of 7 years, is called by various people the tribulation period or the 70th week of Daniel. And so what we find out then is that that period of time is referred to both in Daniel chapter 9, but it's also referred to Daniel chapter 11, Daniel chapter 12, Zechariah 12, 13, and 14, and the entire book of Revelation. That stuff hasn't happened yet, and it's going to happen. So the apocalypse is the way we refer to the unveiling. So I refer to our teaching today as Tisha B'Av and the coming apocalypse, meaning the stuff that's written in the book of Revelation that tells us the church is going to be raptured first, then the Antichrist is going to arise, the temple is going to be rebuilt, and then after the temple's rebuilt, Antichrist is going to go into the temple, declare himself to be God, and then for the next 3.5 years after that, more people are going to die in that 3.5 year period of time that have ever existed in the history of the planet Earth from the time of Adam and Eve in the garden up to Jesus. More people are going to die during that last 42 months, that last 1,260 days, that last 3.5 years of the 7-year period of time prior to Jesus coming back at Armageddon than have existed in the entire history of the planet Earth from Adam and Eve in the garden through Jesus' death on the cross. More people are going to die than were ever born during the first, 4,000 years of human history. That is why I say Tisha B'Av and the apocalypse are related to one another. So let's end up in Romans chapter 11. Paul does an awesome job of tying together why we're talking about this. This isn't just a teaching because we're talking about a Jewish commemoration day. This isn't just for Jewish people. We got the Star of David up there, but Jesus is Israel's best friend. But this is also for Gentiles. Why? Because the God of Israel is the God, not just the God of the Jews. He's the God of everybody. The whole universe is under the control of the God. The other gods that you've heard about in Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Islam, all of those gods are false gods that are really puppets or charades or costumes worn by Satan and the fallen angels to distract the people of the planet Earth from the worship of the one true God, God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ in human flesh. Those people are used, or those fallen angels are used to distract people from the truth. Paul ties it together and gives us a reason as Jews and Gentiles. If you're a son of Adam, you have only one way into the kingdom of heaven: the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, the Lord Jesus Christ. Doesn't matter whether you're Jewish, Gentile. Some people are both Jewish and Gentile mixed together. I've got a Jewish middle name, Irving. I've got a Scottish last name, Walker. I've got a German first name, Herbert. So I got all kinds of stuff mixed up in my family background. But it doesn't matter because I come to just one guy, a one-stop shopping for salvation, the Lord Jesus Christ. Because remember, God put a Gentile into his genealogy. That's what the book of Ruth is all about. So Jews aren't the only people that get saved by the Jewish Messiah. Gentiles can get saved too. Let's go ahead and finish up by taking a look at Romans chapter 11. Starting at verse 1, it says, I say then, hath God cast away his people? Referring to Israel. Tisha B'Av isn't an acknowledgement that God has rejected the Jews for rejecting Jesus and replaced them with a bunch of Canadians, Americans, and British people who call themselves Christians. No. God forbid that occur. God hasn't replaced Israel. Israel's going to replace the born-again Christian church after the rapture. So he says, has God cast away his people, referring to Israel? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite, and of the seed of Abraham, and of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. So in other words, Paul is saying, look, for you Gentiles that might have forgotten, I'm a Jew. I'm a chief of the Jews. I'm an Israelite. You know, I come from an elite Jewish family. I come from the tribe of Benjamin. That's a very prestigious thing to be able to say. He got taught by the highest and most powerful and influential rabbis in the land of Israel. He said, I'm a Jew of the Jews. Don't forget that or miss that point. Then we drop down and he says, even God hasn't replaced Israel, but he says, even so, then at this present time also is there a remnant according to the election of grace. And he says, verse 6, this is key. This is key to the understanding of the foundation of salvation, which is not based upon works, Kim. It's not based upon paying tithes, and it's not based upon how many times you go to a religious ceremony you call going to church. he says this. He says, verse 6 of Romans 11, and if by grace then, it is no more of works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. But if it's of works, then it is no more of grace. Otherwise, work is no more work. In other words, he's saying if salvation is by grace through faith, then works can't have anything to do with it. If you get saved by works, which is what the Pentecostals teach, and the Roman Catholics teach, and the Jehovah's Witnesses teach, and most charismatics teach, and the Calvinists kind of teach, if you get saved by doing stuff, or get saved by not doing stuff like sinning, committing adultery, cursing, smoking cigarettes, stuff like that. If not doing that stuff saves you, that's a work. If going to church saves you, that's a work. If paying money to a religious leader saves you, that's a work. And then therefore it's not by grace. But if the Bible says salvation is by grace through faith alone in Jesus Christ, then it can't be of works. You can't mix the two together. And so we then find out, he goes on to say, verse 7, what then? Israel hath not obtained that which it seeketh for. In other words, Israel isn't saved yet. They will be at the end of the tribulation, but they're not saved yet. And then he says in verse 8, according as it is written, God has given them, Israel, this is key, the spirit of slumber. In other versions it says the spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear unto this day. So the reason why the Jews have a much more difficult time accepting the gospel of Jesus Christ right now than the Gentiles do. When I'm down here on South Beach, a lot of Jewish people come by, they see the Star of David, they hear about Jesus, kind of interested, but I'm Jewish, I can't accept Jesus because that's Christianity. So they reject Christianity because of Adolf Hitler was a Christian, and the Roman Catholic Church are Christians, and because the Catholic Church and Adolf Hitler persecuted the Jews, they don't want to have anything to do with that. So they'll reject Jesus. But Paul says the real reason that's happening is that God has given Israel, the Jewish people of the world, a spirit of stupor, so they can't fully understand the gospel. Why is that? The reason, Paul says, is so that Gentiles who were worshiping the pagan gods of Satanism would have an opportunity to hear about the Jewish God of the Bible, and they could get saved too. And that when a bunch of Gentiles start getting saved by the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, God in human flesh, the second man, the kinsman redeemer, Jesus, when Gentile pagans start getting saved by the Jewish Messiah, Israel will start getting jealous that those godless pagans started coming not to the gods of Rome and Greece and Persia, but to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to get saved through the person of God in human flesh, Jesus of Nazareth. And then the Israelites, the Jews, would get jealous and say, we want some of that too. If those ignorant, God-forsaken pagans can get into the kingdom of heaven through this Jesus, we're going to get in too. And so the spirit of stupor, slumber, has come over Jews regarding the gospel of Jesus Christ for the temporary time being, so that more Gentiles can get saved. But there is a specific number. When the last Gentile, God says there's going to be a specific number. When that last Gentile gets saved, that's going to be it. We don't know when that day is going to occur, but it's coming fast. And when that final Gentile gets saved by the Jewish Messiah through a gospel preached by Jews to the Gentile world, then God's going to say that the time of the Gentiles is complete. And what God is going to do is remove his bride, the church, from the world in an event called the rapture, which we've talked about and we'll talk about sometime in the future. So let's finish up then. Okay, let's pick up in verse 11. Paul says, Romans chapter 11, verse 11, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall, referring to Israel? God forbid, but rather through their fall, Israel's fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles. Me and you and most of the people out there in video land. We got some Jewish believers that are followers of our South Beach Gospel Ministries, but mostly we got Gentiles. But guess what? Israel is stumbled by God so that you can get saved and your